You're listening to the Ballet Piano Podcast, lifting the lid on dance accompaniment.
Hello listeners and welcome back to another episode of the Ballet Piano Podcast. My name is Chris Hobson and I'm joined by Akiko Hobson.
Hello.
Matt Gregory.
Hello listeners and viewers.
And this week we are in conversation with a composer and a pianist who I think has possibly got one of the biggest prolific outputs of the last few decades. It's Mr. Philip Feeney. Hello.
Hello there.
He's so famous, he only goes by his surname.
Yes, that's it. So we have got Feeney with us.
Feeney.
I prefer that one. Yeah.
It's easy to remember, Feeney. So how are you, Feeney?
I'm good. I've had a couple of weeks when I haven't been walking that well. I had a hip replacement. So I was getting gold stars from the consultant, and then I got a bit of bursitis, and I was hobbling around. I felt that I was going backwards, but at the moment it's okay.
Oh, good. Yes.
Good. Things are on the up. So The reason I've wanted you to come on the podcast for years, and it's because simply you are a name that everybody knows. If you speak with anybody from Central School of Ballet, anybody who's been in Northern Ballet Theatre or who's danced with any of your music, who's just speaks about you with the highest acclaim. It's universal.
And when we very first started the podcast and we did our wish list, Phil Feeney was at the top of that wish list, wasn't he? Definitely. And then it was just a case of pinning you down.
So here we are. Yeah. So how did you get interested in playing for dance? Because you studied at Cambridge and then you moved to study in Rome, and then am I right in thinking your first job was at the Teatro Danza di Roma?
Yes, it was. The reason why I got into it is the reason why most musicians get into it is basically I was in Rome with no money whatsoever. And so I was actually teaching English, and I was really bad at that. Privately teaching English. I didn't mean to be. I was, but I didn't really, I guess, take it sufficiently seriously. And then I met other people on the course that I was doing in Rome, which was at the Accademia di Santa Cecilia. There was one other guy there, a composer who was working with Elsa Paperno at the Teatro Danza, and he said, easy, you can just go along and it's easy and all that stuff, and money for old road.
Yeah, 5 minutes out of an improvisation.
And then you go in and it's a nightmare. And just like every class pianist, you're rubbish at it.
Then you start.
And then that's, of course, that's the danger point, because that's when a lot of really good musicians don't want to stay in there anymore, because they can play Chopin studies but just being humiliated most days it's a lot to take. But I got a taste for it, and I'm very pleased that I started off playing for contemporary.
That you started playing contemporary first.
Yeah, but she was doing. They were all pretty inspirational people in those days. Not saying saying they're not now, but that was a common thing in contemporary dance. It was a slightly sort of guru feel.
Yeah. Can you remember that very first class?
The very first class I did. I didn't do it. Elsa wasn't there, so I did it with one of the members of the company.
Yeah,
I think we had quite a lot of patience.
They have to have patience when you get started.
When you first
go, yeah.
But their pianist at that time was Antonio Coppola, who was a fabulous pianist.
Yeah.
And of course, once you see somebody else do it, you got twigs. You're not trying to copy them or anything, but you get the understanding that it's not necessarily about your product. It's about what your process, what you do, and it's just actually that unfashionable thing for a pianist is to be looking elsewhere. Even pianists in the orchestra, they're the ones who don't look at the conductor.
Yeah.
Oh, fair enough. We have lots of notes to play, but so it just actually when you're playing in a studio and looking at other people doing things, dancing, and that makes an enormous difference.
So you pretty much sort of learnt your craft then in Rome for the contemporary side of things.
Yes, that's it. And then I started playing for ballet afterwards.
Right. Because then you came back to that. I've been stalking your website and the internet. Because I think pretty every ballet company's got a page about you on there.
Yes.
It'll be the same stuff, I'm sure.
So you came back to London in 1984. Is that when you joined Central School of Ballet?
It was. I came back because I knew the people from London Contemporary. I was coming back to work there, but of course they had a full phalanx of great musicians. There were some really good ones in those days. And so, but Central at the time were renting studios in the place, in the same building.
Right.
So they kind of said, we haven't got any work, but they want or somebody. So I went and that's when I started playing at Central. And Central, really, I mean, they've been so good to me, giving me a lot of space to pursue other things as well.
Yeah.
But it just also the right from the start, there was a sort of balance between the contemporary and the classical.
Yeah.
And when you started, were you playing both equally, ballet and contemporary at Central?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yes, I sort of still am. I tend to. It depends whether if there's a great number of contemporary musicians, then I will be playing less.
Yeah.
But then sometimes there are no musicians who are playing for contemporary. So you suddenly find I got a lot more classes. But I like to do, and I also like to. It always seemed to struck me as quite important that the musicians, if the dancers see the musicians giving the same amount of weight for contemporary as to classical, then that makes it less legitimate to say, "Oh, I'm just a ballet dancer."
Which
is, of course,
definitely.
Which is not going to get you a job.
Certainly not in 2024.
Do you have a preference for ballet or contemporary?
Well, when I work at London Contemporary, as well as working at Central, it was really good balance because you when you start getting fed up of the sort of self-indulgence of contemporary, you go up to the ballet, the beautiful flowing movement. Then other times when ballet gets a little rigid. Yes, it's wonderful to go back to do the contemporary. So, and of course, they kind of cross-fertilize a lot as well. So it's not that there's not that kind of apartheid that there was back in the 80s when it was seen that anyone who did contemporary shouldn't touch ballet, and the other way around, which always seemed to me nonsense. But it's like why a classical musician playing rock or folk or something, why not? C major chords is a C major chord.
So let's get into possibly the thing that you're most famous for, dare I say, worldwide, which is your prolific composition output.
Do the stats.
Right.
Do the stats.
Oh, so is it about 20? Is it about 20 full lengths overall? Or something like that?
Oh my heavens!
I was looking at your website. I think it's about 50 short works in one act.
I've done lots of short ones. Because we're working with Ballet Central. That means that I was kind of contracted, if you like, to producing work each year for each of the students. So that meant that there was a constant supply of music. But I got into doing working with companies mainly through Christopher Gable, who of course was the founding director of Central, as well as then becoming artistic director of Northern, and he was a fabulously charismatic chap. Had lots of riz, as they say. But he was also he wanted to do ballet, if you like, in a way that was much more real and about an individual and about people. And so he consequently found quite a lot of the music didn't work. It's not that it wasn't great music, but it just a lot of ballet music is has the slow bit, the preparation, and then it has the faster bit at the end, and so it's kind of fairly restrictive. And so he was looking to find a sort of music where you could would still give them a lot of dancing space, but had a lot more space to develop character and actually do proper narrative.
Yeah. Because he was, am I right? I think he was sort of almost like he was a pioneer, wasn't he? Basically, Gable with Northern Ballet
Yes,
Theatre.
I think so. I mean, I see him as such. Yes, because he transformed the company into a sort of. It was Northern Ballet Theatre at the time.
Yes,
and that
I think I'll always know it as Northern Ballet Theatre.
I know, NBT.
Yeah,
that's the theatre was important, not because because often it means when we're concentrating more on theatre than dancing, i.e. the dancing is not so good. But it doesn't mean just like American Ballet Theatre. It just means that the work is theatrical, and has a theatrical premise, and not just simply something which is just manifesting great dance. And that's why they have a whole history of doing narrative ballets. And if you're doing a narrative ballet according to the Christopher Gable way of doing it or the Michael Pink way of doing it, you automatically need a new score because no other music fits.
Can that take us nicely onto your Dracula?
The Dracula, yes.
No, I think that was slightly before I started going to the theatre when that was first. But I know, great names, Richard Herriot.
Oh, Richard.
Who just,
wonderful pianist.
Oh, he's fantastic, Richard. Sort of almost introduced me to your work. I remember him lending me a CD of Dracula. I was like, this is amazing. So was that was your first big project with Northern?
No. I'd done Strange Meeting with Michael Pink, and then Christopher did his Cinderella. So I did that. That was the first 3-act ballet I did with Northern.
Right.
And that was a very. I'm very fond of the whole of the production, but I have to say I was working on the premise that as I'd found certainly working with Christopher, but working with a lot of choreographers, is that they change their mind a lot.
Yes.
And so they don't need the music changed. So I thought, well, if you wait long enough for them to actually work out what they really want, then it's great. You can service them for that. But of course, in terms of a piece 5 minutes long, that's absolutely fine. If it's over 100 minutes of music, and then you've got to orchestrate it.
Yeah,
that you can't be doing that. And I left it far too late, and I was basically saved by John Longstaff in particular at Northern.
Yes, living legend John Longstaff.
Absolutely. Well, he came in and did a lot of orchestrating for Cinderella and really helped me through that. And so Dracula was the next one down. So all the things I'd learnt in Cinderella learnt not what to do.
Yes.
as well as the other thing. It meant that it could roll much smoother, I think. And it was about 7 or 8 years into the Christopher Gable reign. And so his team were very comfortable with working with one another.
Right.
Les Brotherstone, Polly Pyant, Michael Pink.
Yeah.
There was a freedom of exchange, of a creative exchange, I guess it is. Usually with quite a lot of bottles of wine.
The best creative way.
in Christopher's house in Leytonstone. And he, so there was, we'd actually be throwing in different ideas. So for the example, the start of Act 2 in Dracula is actually Michael Pink's idea.
Right.
Because it starts, after all the castle nastiness of the first act, we suddenly into Whitby and the charming Edwardian feel of Whitby. So I'm trying to create that. But Michael's saying, well, but Dracula's going to come and destroy all of this. Can't we give them a taste of that? So it starts off with this fantastic storm. Then I had to somehow twisted into a waltz. Easy, well, and of course you can do that with a 6/8 3/4 change around, a metrical modulation. But yes, but it's if you feel free to be able to receive other people's ideas.
So your sort of, I don't know if this is the right phrase, composition process, if you like. Are you led by the narrative, or are you led by duration, or is it a mixture of both? Is it sort of a narrative for this, and then you would provide the music to the choreographer, stroke director, and then you work from there together? Obviously, I presume each project is different as well.
Yes, each project is absolutely different. The very big narrative ballets, they always start off with the narrative first. Whether how tied down that is, that can change. But there's always a synopsis, which you kind of have to go. And then we put in, sort of ballpark figures of 4.5 minutes, 3 minutes. They're often not spot on because, as we know, that 4.5 minutes of slow music is not that long. 4.5 minutes of fast music. Awful.
It's a lot of orchestration.
So it sort of depends on what it is, and it depends where you are in the ballet. So at the beginning, you things take longer because you've got all sorts of other things. Introduce the characters, introduce the music. Whereas later on, it can go faster. So you find these out as you're going on, but you want to try and plan it as best you can, but there's always cutting and snipping and editing it across the line, and you have to take that as read. It's I do produce my first draft has to be at a level where if they think that is absolutely it. But that rarely happens. But if they do, you don't want to just do something which is just half. Well, it could be something like this, and they say yes. Then you've got a piece of fairly loose music. So you've got to make it good enough so that if it does work, but also leave enough room, a hemline.
Yes.
So you can either extend it or shorten it or expand it, take it off in some other direction, without it because ultimately it's the final cut, literally, that the audience are going to hear, and they don't want to hear the patchwork that goes into it. No, of course not. So that can be tricky sometimes.
And has your sort of composition process, if you like, changed over the last few decades? Because remember we did an in conversation with John Sweeney a couple of years ago, and he was saying that he'll often work inside a ballet class for progressions, ideas that he's going to be using in the silent movies and things like that. So do you do something similar when you're composing with your ballet classes and your contemporary classes?
A little bit. I know what I do use contemporary classes in particular, but sometimes ballet classes to sort of work on material. But it's always anything that works really well in ballet class or contemporary class. It works, and you think, great, I can use that for that scene there. You try and do it. It never. It worked well in the class, but and there might be things in it,
an element that you can take and insert somewhere.
And so that's useful time anyway. So spent, and anyway, it's having an inquiring approach to playing for class always makes for better class.
Yeah.
Nothing is ever wasted.
And just for my own morbid curiosity, have you got a favourite? Actually, this was a question I was with. I don't know if you remember Amber Doyle, who was a central back in the day. And I was talking with Amber yesterday. She said, I said, if you were going to ask Feeney anything, what would it be? She said, well, what's his favourite work that he's ever composed? Because there's so many to choose from.
I don't really. I actually don't do favourites.
Right.
Even in people say, what's your favourite Beethoven symphony or something? I like them all. It's just like. Who's your favourite composer? Well, I don't know.
Are there any ballets that maybe mean more to you than others? Because of the creation or the person you worked with, or a point in your life?
Probably. It's because the ballets tend to take a long, they take a long time, take a long chunk of your life, really. So I will look back with fondness about that period of time. Really with pretty rosy glasses. Because
when you look back, everything's always rose tinted, isn't it?
Because it's quite intense when you're doing that. So you're only remembering the good bits. But no, my overall feeling is Christ, how the hell did I do that?
It's amazing, isn't it? How one person can make all that work.
No, but not so much the quantity. It's just it seems impossible. When I'm starting out something else, I think, I can do it just like I did that, and I did it. And then of course, I can't remember how you get to those points, and it's a process of each piece has its own inputs at certain times. So so it quite often feels like it's not really. They take on a life of their own. I think that's what I'm saying.
And I'm guessing that technology's had a massive influence on your work. Let's call it a workflow, if you like, on the way that you work over the years. as technology's developed, and we've got things like Logic, Sibelius, and all those sorts of software facilities.
I've always been something of a mixing desk composer, to be honest. Back even in the late 80s, I always having extra bits of electronics in. But I find it is using the computer. Well, we use it all the time now, of course. So I don't do quite as much sitting down and just playing on things and sorting. I think you put into the computer stuff that's less worked on, and then you work on it when you're on the computer. That's true.
Refine it digitally.
When you're composing the piano, it's more like you would in a studio or piano. You're working it to get it right. So to some extent, that I'm not sure. And undoubtedly, certain things are much quicker. In particular, notating. The first scores I did for Northern, I did in pencil.
Wow.
Actually in pencil and ruler and rubber and things like that. Because you didn't need to have them done in ink because they get printed out, photocopied. But it was so things took an awful long time. The great copyist thing. So you do the part. The score. Then the parts would all be sent off to copyists. And I do remember that in the first ballet I did, because after Dracula it was all done on the computer. But in Cinderella, they sent the score off to the copyists, and then when in the parts, the suite in Act 2, there's like a suite, a Baroque suite. They made the U look like H. Which of course the orchestra thought was very good fun.
The Northern Band would have loved that.
They did. They thought that was great.
For that first band rehearsal, the giggles.
Absolutely.
And also, I was just thinking as well. Then, when we were talking about technology, we've all got a computer now in our pockets all the time. We've all got our mobile phones or a tablet, which is great. But because it makes the world, it brings us all closer together. But then the demands to get things done.
Yes.
It's increasing because somebody will email you something, or you can send a revision, and you're getting things backwards and forwards very, very, very quickly.
No, that's right. I'm not sure whether it necessarily makes for better music. You can. It's easy to get into cut and paste and certain things, whereas you wouldn't do if you were doing it just writing a piece of chamber music or something like that. So I don't know.
And are you attracted sort of specifically to projects based on sort of things like the narrative, or can it be a combination of things like the narrative of the story, the company, the choreographer, the director?
I do tend. I mean, in Ballet Central, I do a lot less narrative work. In fact, very rarely do they do narrative because it's not that kind of a program. But when I'm doing company pieces, they tend to be narrative for the reason I was saying that's why you need a score. Yeah. And of course, then you start getting a reputation for if we're going to do a narrative, let's get Feeney. Yeah. So to some extent that's clearly one of the things that I can do. I do find I feel uncomfortable when there's a score, a narrative ballet which is just using existing scores or something. That I feel that you either chop the music so that it fits the scene,
yes,
or the scene has to be padded out to make the music last, and so it can lose the momentum that's so important in narrative work a little bit.
The first ballet I was lucky enough to play of yours, which we said just before we pressed the record button, was one of the fiendishly difficult Feeney ballets, Hamlet, back in 2007. No, I think it was premiered 2008.
Yes.
And that was the first time I'd sort of been involved in a creative process from start to finish, really. I came in as a freelancer, but I just remember sweating over that score because it was one of the more difficult scores I'd learned for.
Did you hate the composer at that time?
I might have said similar. I might have said many words beginning with F that weren't Feeney when I was learning it.
It's so funny because you started sweating before we pressed record on this episode.
I was sweating when Feeney said yes to come on the episode. Yes. But the way that you could create an atmosphere. I mean, for those of you who didn't see Hamlet or know anything about it, it was David Nixon Ballet 15, 16 years ago. It was dark. It was Hamlet set in occupied Paris. And there was a scene in the second act where Ophelia was being raped by a load of Nazi officers. It was not a family ballet. And so it was a fantastic piece of dance theatre. And that score for that ballet summed everything up about it. I mean, for me, the score made that ballet. I sound like I'm just kissing your ass here, but I honestly mean it, I promise.
I think what the one thing that has to be said is that I've always really, I suppose, not from right at the beginning, but I've always given the choreographer some sort of a digitally processed software version.
Yeah.
And so I work hard on that to make it sound effective. So that it would as if you're going to use that for the actual score, actually in the theatre. Sometimes meaning that you actually when they come to orchestrate, I can't actually get the same then that can be a problem. But so something like Hamlet, he wanted this dark story, so that was my brief, really, just to make it edgy and nice. I mean, of course, I having done Dracula, I knew the kind of that dark area to go down into. Which that was a great process. I enjoyed that ballet a lot. But as you say, it wasn't a family.
I remember coming back from a family holiday. It was in January, just before the rehearsal started. I had the score with me on holiday and the CD, and I was listening to it while I was on holiday in Spain and on the way home trying to go to the
CDs, eh?
I know. Yes. AA powered batteries. So, if you're looking back on your career, I'm saying that not that it's over, because it isn't. It's by no means over. But what you must be just proud of the work that you've done and continue to do. And how things grow and how the the choreography has grown with your music and your output as well, and how the world's changed and theatre's changed, and you've been a part of that.
I just feel like I've sort of been just carrying on what I do.
Yeah.
Really. I don't feel. I think narrative ballet had a massive slump. Sort of 20 years ago, there was a lot of choreographers who didn't really want to touch it. And so I've just sort of started working in it in the 90s and just sort of carried on. I think now narrative ballet is much more attractive to companies and choreographers, and so suddenly we find ourselves more back in fashion. But I've not really ever been on the cutting edge. But what I think I have been affected by this kind of a postmodern idea of being able to use all sorts of dip into all sorts of different styles and ways of making music in a way that so that it's going to serve the story, the narrative. And I've always thought about doing that, and I think that is part of a kind of modern zeitgeist. If you look at somebody's playlist, they're going to have all sorts of different music on that playlist. And I rather than this is the 2020s, we write music like this. That is, which might have been the case 100 years ago. Or something. I think there's anything goes, and to be able to slip from a sort of a fairly contemporary, even a sort of avant-garde harmonic structure, and then just zip off into an early romantic one, then it's quite feasible. And I think I've got that quite a lot through sort of the mixing desks, where you could have a bit of Ligeti and a bit of Mendelssohn or something, and do a bit of swap. Yeah. You can create kind of this interesting distances and spatial effects. Yeah. And you can do that, of course, orchestrally. So and that's very helpful. At the moment, I'm doing with Kathy Marston. She takes bits of real music.
Real music.
Oh, yes.
Real music. She's doing a piece on Clara Schumann. So it's Schumann and Brahms. All of which is fabulous music. But we've got to try and tie it together. And that's a particular case and point where you have that world, the world of mid-19th century, and then you have a 2020s world, and you can quite easily go into that world without it in any way seeming alien to the Schumann world. But it needs to be done with care and high respect, of course, of the music you have. But because that's the world we live in is surrounded by 2020 things, and then, but we're also perfectly used to hearing music of different times. I mean, just think how Baroque music sort of comes into all sorts of things. Go to Cafe Nero.
Yes. Or in a lift or an elevator in America somewhere, or the shop, or the grocery store.
Yes.
Yeah. So what's next for Feeney? What's the big projects for the next couple of years?
Yeah, that's at the moment it's doing this Clara Schumann thing that's coming up in October, but we're kind of it's got to, up until sort of April, where I'm sort of pulling all that together. So that's the main thing at the moment.
And then you can rest a little bit over the summer.
Well, I'm because of lockdown and stuff. I've been lucky to have quite a lot of pieces of mine being done again, and that's fine. You just turn up, and well, you also have the benefit of if you go and they're looking at something like Dracula and they're thinking, I can't play this or something like that. I just say, well, they did in Northern, so they've obviously better orchestra.
What's that like? It must be like a double reward, I was thinking, for a composer, because you go to the orchestra rehearsals and you hear your music live for the first time.
Yeah.
And that's the thrill for most composers, isn't it? But then when you go to the theatre and you've got opening night and you see it in the opening night with the visuals as well, that's almost like a double reward. Must be.
Well, the first the orchestral rehearsal is that's where you find out whether you've orchestrated it properly, whether the balance is going to work, and there are always bits and pieces that need to be done. So it's not, you don't just sit there.
No, of course not. Yeah,
look at this fruit salad; it's lovely. So and then usually the performances are tense affairs anyway. They're, because everybody else has got high adrenaline, but you're not actually doing anything.
Yeah, you're in control of nothing, I suppose. Are you really?
Absolutely nothing. No.
It's John Price Jones who's in control of your work.
Good old John. Well, he did a good job as well. I mean, there are times where Andy Sells would never play the lament from in mirror, mirror at the speed that I wanted it.
Right.
It was always too fast, I thought. But that's because I was thinking about how I'd written it. But of course, what I hadn't thought about is that it goes through the whole process of it being in a studio for 6 months.
Yeah.
And it had taken on a momentum of its own. And of course, that's why. So I'm thinking, it's got to be slow. and of course, it didn't. Because by the time it had gone into the ballet, it needed that sort of.
It had gone through puberty
flowing.
Almost.
Yeah, that's right. So you do have to, people will say, "Well, have you got any notes?" And it gets to the point where maybe the bassoon's a bit loud there, and those sort of notes, rather than. And you just have to give it away. Which is in itself something which is very. It's a good thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
Feeney.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you around on the coffee table for the last half an hour or so. Thank you so much. And if people want to find out a little bit more about you and want to have a little stalk, your website is philipfeeney.com, isn't it?
That's right. That's me. Yeah, it badly needs upgrading, but
it needs to be just www.feeney.com.
Yeah.
So, Feeney, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.